The project that the New York Times was given a Pulitzer for this year of recasting the history of the United States in terms of slavery as the primary narrative, the 1619 Project, seems to me just to be fundamentally historically wrong. It's a distortion. This isn't to say that slavery didn't matter. It just doesn't mean it's not important. It's just that if you were to try to explain the significance of the United States to a visiting Martian, you wouldn't start with slavery because that wasn't really an especially unique feature of the United States. There was slavery and it lasted much longer in Brazil. There was slavery and it was far harsher in the Caribbean colonies of Britain and other European states. So what's the defining characteristic? What's the thing that makes the United States distinctive? It's not slavery.
From a historian's perspective, what do you think that the average American should know about the history of America that we don't know or that we underappreciate? Because, we seem to live in a time where we're erasing our own history and we're taking down monuments and we're, destroying the names of people that were flawed, but that were just people of their time.
Well, I think the challenge here is that history is not it's not monochrome. The history of any great society or state can't be told as a eulogy, nor as a kind of criminal indictment. And the good historian of the United States, or for that matter, of the United Kingdom, acknowledges that there are debits as well as credits, that there's shadow, there's dark sides to the story as well as bright sides. And this is a challenge that I didn't think was difficult when I was writing early in my career. I wrote a history of the British Empire, which included a chapter on the American Revolution, and the book sets out very plainly the many stains on the history of the British Empire, including, of course, the central role of slavery in the southern colonies that became the southern states of the United States. But the point of that book, and I'd make the same argument about the history of the United States, is that the benefits outweighed the costs, that the successes were more important ultimately than the failures. The project that the New York Times was given a Pulitzer for this year of recasting the history of the United States in terms of slavery as the primary narrative, the 1619 Project, seems to me just to be fundamentally historically wrong. It's a distortion. This isn't to say that slavery didn't matter. It just doesn't mean it's not important. It's just that if you were to try to explain the significance of the United States to a visiting Martian, you wouldn't start with slavery because that wasn't really an especially unique feature of the United States. There was slavery and it lasted much longer in Brazil. There was slavery and it was far harsher in the Caribbean colonies of Britain and other European states. So what's the defining characteristic? What's the thing that makes the United States distinctive? It's not slavery any more than if you looked at Western civilization broadly. It would be true to say that imperialism's the defining characteristic. Everybody did empire, just as slavery goes way back before 1619, all the way to ancient times, and by the way, still exists. There is still slavery. There are slave markets where people are sold. There are slave economies which rely on slave labor today. So it can't really be true to say that the interesting thing, the thing you really need to know about the United States is slavery. But the interesting thing about the United States is that it represented an experiment in governance, a radical experiment based on ideas from the Enlightenment and earlier ideas from the Protestant Reformation, it's fair to say. And this produced an extraordinary constitution which has stood up to all the stresses and strains of history since the late 18th century, and understanding that peculiar constitution, that very distinctive document with its separation of powers and its careful preservations of individual liberty, that should be your top priority if you're studying American history. Not to the exclusion of the bad stuff. There's plenty of bad stuff that we need to study. But I don't think we should be teaching young Americans from Howard Zinn's People's History of the United States, in which the negatives are constantly emphasized over the positives. That just seems to me to miss the point of the American story completely.
Are you worried that the extraordinary pressures that we're facing right now, between a pandemic, between riots and protests, between, polarization that really is off the charts, and then throw in social media, which is just gas on the flame, are you worried that those pressures could snap that project in a way that it hasn't been snapped before? Or certainly in the last 100 years, let's say?
Dave, let me give you a somewhat surprising answer to that question. I'd be worried if we weren't worried. One of the things about this country that's very distinctive is that we're always worried that the republic's going to end. We're always kind of fretting about the coming tyranny, the impending civil war, and thus far there's been one civil war and no dictatorships, and that's kind of encouraging. I think that's partly because we worry about it. And I think it's a healthy feature of American life also to expect decline. People have been predicting the decline of the United States throughout my life. It was a preoccupation of Henry Kissinger, whose biography I'm in the midst of writing. In the 1970s, it seemed as if the United States was being torn apart by Vietnam, torn apart by its racial divisions, torn apart by a president who had violated his oath of office. All of that we've seen before. And I think it's part of the way the United States works that we're always expecting the disintegration of the republic and the descent into civil war. And I think we'll have to start being nervous if we stop worrying about that stuff. But as long as we have my old friend Andrew Sullivan so fretful about the coming Trump tyranny that he doesn't quite spot the tyranny of the left until it's right up behind him. I mean, that's kind of the predicament that I think a lot of liberals and conservatives find themselves in, that they were so indignant and dismayed by Trump back in 2016 that they slightly underestimated the rather more operationally worrying tyrannical tendencies of the radical left. So yeah, I think we should keep worrying about this stuff. And as long as we're worrying about it, we'll probably be okay.
Yeah. Does it also strike you as odd or maybe obvious relative to social media that when something happens here, that it suddenly happens everywhere? I mean, we've all seen the videos now of literally police officers in London being hunted down by mobs. That has nothing to do in any concrete sense with what happened to George Floyd, and yet it seems like if there's an incident here, it's now exported everywhere.
I think future historians will wonder why it was that in the midst of a pandemic, which is far from over, Americans decided to have a debate about police violence towards African Americans. Not to say that that's not an important issue to think about, but it seems an odd time to have that debate and to start debates about defunding the police when we should really be wondering what went wrong at the Department of Health and Human Services and CDC when they ought to have taken far better and earlier action to contain the contagion. There's something strange. It's a non sequitur that in the midst of this massive public health crisis, which has killed nearly 120,000 Americans and will probably kill another 120,000 before the end of the year, we're having this debate. But the second point I'd make is that the internet has created a new kind of contagion. As I said earlier, quoting my son, there are two pandemics. And this second pandemic, in fact, predates the murder of George Floyd, because it's a pandemic of protest that you could actually see in Hong Kong, in Santiago, in Barcelona, in cities like Beirut last year. And what is interesting to me is that the mode of protest is consistently the same. The content varies from place to place. But this quality of protest to go viral, styles of protest to be copied from Hong Kong to Minneapolis is really interesting. I mean, historically, the police had better communications than demonstrators for most of the second half of the 20th century. The police had walkie-talkies and the demonstrators were lucky if they had megaphones. But the smartphone has changed that. And it's allowed protesters to really organize these acephalous networks where there is no obvious leader and actually have superior comms to the police.
If you're looking for more honest and thoughtful conversations about academia instead of nonstop yelling, check out our academia playlist. And if you want to watch full interviews on a variety of topics, check out our full episode playlist. They're all right over here. And to get notified of all future videos, be sure to subscribe and click the notification bell.